November 17, 2022. William C. Holman Correctional Facility, Atmore, Alabama. Kenneth Eugene Smith, 57 years old, lies strapped to a gurney in the execution chamber. For nearly 4 hours, medical personnel attempt to establish intravenous access. They insert needles into his arms, hands, and legs. Again and again. Smith writhes in pain. He cries out. Outside the chamber, witnesses watch in horror as the state of Alabama tries, and fails, to execute a man who has been on death row for 28 years. At 11:21 p.m., the Alabama Department of Corrections announces the execution has been called off. Kenneth Smith becomes one of only 3 people in modern American history to survive a botched execution attempt. But this story doesn't end there. 14 months later, Alabama will try again, this time using a method never before used to execute a human being in the United States. In this documentary, we're going to examine the full story behind Kenneth Eugene Smith's case, from the brutal murder for hire that put him on death row in 1989, to the legal battles that followed, to the night Alabama failed to execute him, and finally, to the controversial method used to complete his sentence. We'll explore what went wrong that November night, the ethical questions raised by his botched execution, and the unprecedented decision to use nitrogen hypoxia as a method of capital punishment. This is the story of a crime, a punishment, and a system pushed to its breaking point. To understand how Kenneth Smith ended up on that gurney in 2022, we need to go back 33 years, to March 18, 1989, in Colbert County, Alabama. It was a Saturday night. Spring was just beginning to bloom across the Tennessee Valley. And in a quiet suburb of Sheffield, a conspiracy was about to turn deadly. Around 10:30 p.m. on March 18, 1989, Sheffield police received a 911 call from 4608 Lakeview Drive. The caller was Charles Sennett Sr., a local pastor and businessman. His voice was shaking. He told the dispatcher he'd just come home to find his wife unresponsive. She wasn't breathing. There was blood. When officers arrived at the modest brick ranch house, they found the front door unlocked. Inside, the living room appeared mostly undisturbed. A television was on, lamps were lit, a coffee table held a few magazines. But as they moved through the home, they noticed signs of a struggle. A chair was overturned. A lamp had been knocked askew. Then they found her. In the hallway leading to the bedroom, 45-year-old Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett lay on her back, lifeless. She was wearing a nightgown. Around her neck was a telephone cord, pulled tight. Her face showed signs of trauma, bruising, swelling. The medical examiner would later count 8 stab wounds to her chest and abdomen. The attack had been vicious and sustained. This was no random burglary gone wrong. This was personal. This was rage. And within hours, investigators would begin to suspect this was something even darker, murder for hire. Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett, known to friends and family as Liz, was 45 years old at the time of her death. She had been married to Charles Sennett for nearly 2 decades. They had no children together, though Charles had children from a previous marriage. By all accounts, Liz was a kind, soft-spoken woman, a homemaker who kept a tidy house, attended church regularly, and was beloved by those who knew her. But her marriage had been troubled. Friends later said Liz had confided in them that Charles could be controlling, temperamental. There had been talk of separation. Still, those who knew her never imagined her life would end this way, violently, in her own home, on a quiet Saturday night. Liz Sennett was a victim not just of violence, but of betrayal by someone who had vowed to protect her. News of Elizabeth Sennett's murder spread quickly through Sheffield and the surrounding towns of Colbert County. This was a tight-knit community where violent crime was rare. The idea that a respected pastor's wife had been murdered in her own home sent shockwaves through the area. Church congregations held vigils. Neighbors locked their doors for the first time in years. Parents kept their children closer. The local newspaper ran headlines asking, "Who could do such a thing?" And more urgently, was the killer still out there? But as investigators began to dig into the case, they uncovered something that would shake the community even more profoundly than the murder itself. From the moment detectives from the Sheffield Police Department and the Colbert County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene, something didn't sit right. The house showed minimal signs of forced entry. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. And Charles Sennett's behavior raised red flags. Lead investigator Randy Christian noted that Charles seemed oddly composed for a man who had just found his wife murdered. His timeline was inconsistent. He claimed he'd been out of town on church business, but his alibi had gaps. And when detectives asked about his marriage, Charles was evasive. Within days, investigators learned something critical. Charles Sennett was in serious financial trouble. His heating and air conditioning business was failing. He owed creditors thousands of dollars. And crucially, Liz had recently taken out a life insurance policy worth $100,000, with Charles as the sole beneficiary. The motive became clear. But who had actually carried out the killing? Detectives began interviewing Charles's associates, employees, and acquaintances. They followed leads to local bars, construction sites, and known criminals in the area. And eventually, a name surfaced: Billy Gray Williams, a drifter and small-time criminal who had done occasional work for Charles's business. When police brought Williams in for questioning on March 22, just 4 days after the murder, he initially denied any involvement. But as the interrogation continued, Williams began to crack. He admitted he'd been inside the Sennett home that night. He said he'd been hired to kill Elizabeth Sennett. And he wasn't alone. Williams told detectives that another man had been with him, a man named Kenneth Eugene Smith. Kenneth Eugene Smith was born on January 4, 1965, in rural Alabama. By the time of Elizabeth Sennett's murder, he was 24 years old, a construction worker with a spotty employment history and a growing list of minor criminal offenses. Friends described him as someone who drifted from job to job, struggled with authority, and often seemed to be looking for quick money. Smith had no violent felonies on his record prior to 1989, but he ran in rough circles. He associated with petty criminals, drinkers, and hustlers. By his mid-20s, he was a man going nowhere, until Charles Sennett made him an offer. Billy Gray Williams, on the other hand, was 34 years old in 1989. He had a longer criminal history than Smith, including burglary and theft charges. He was known as someone who could be hired for dirty work, no questions asked. He'd done odd jobs for Charles Sennett's heating and air business, and according to testimony, Charles knew Williams was the kind of man who might be willing to commit murder for the right price. According to Williams's confession, Charles Sennett had approached him weeks before the murder with a proposition: kill his wife, and he'd pay $1,000 upfront, with more to come after he collected the life insurance. Williams agreed, and recruited Kenneth Smith to help. What would drive two men to agree to murder a woman they didn't know, for such a relatively small sum of money? For Kenneth Smith, those who knew him said he'd grown up in poverty, with little stability or opportunity. He'd dropped out of school early, struggled to hold down jobs, and by his 20s had developed a pattern of making impulsive, destructive decisions. He wasn't known as violent, but he was desperate. And desperation can make people do unthinkable things. Billy Gray Williams had a similar background: decades of instability, minor crimes, and poor judgment. Both men were vulnerable to manipulation by someone like Charles Sennett, a man with authority, money, and a plan. But understanding their backgrounds doesn't excuse what they did. On the night of March 18, 1989, Kenneth Smith and Billy Gray Williams made a choice that would destroy multiple lives, including their own. According to statements later given by both Williams and Smith, here is what happened on the night of March 18, 1989. Charles Sennett had arranged to be out of town, establishing an alibi. He left his wife home alone, knowing what was coming. Around 10 p.m., Kenneth Smith and Billy Gray Williams drove to the Sennett home. They entered through an unlocked door, likely left that way intentionally by Charles. Inside, they found Elizabeth in the living room. She was startled but not immediately afraid. Perhaps she thought they were associates of her husband. But within moments, the attack began. Williams and Smith grabbed her. The struggle moved through the living room and into the hallway. She screamed. They tried to silence her. At some point, one of the men produced a knife. Elizabeth was stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen. Even as she bled, they weren't certain she was dead. So they wrapped a telephone cord around her neck and pulled it tight, strangling her until she stopped moving. Then they left. They met with Charles Sennett shortly after, and he paid them the promised $1,000, split between the two of them. $500 each. The price of Elizabeth Sennett's life. On March 22, 1989, 4 days after the murder, Billy Gray Williams was arrested and brought in for questioning. Within hours, he confessed and implicated Kenneth Smith and Charles Sennett. Kenneth Smith was arrested the following day. Unlike Williams, Smith initially denied everything. He claimed he'd been nowhere near the Sennett home that night. But the evidence was mounting. Forensic analysis tied both men to the scene. Witnesses placed them together in the days leading up to the murder. And Williams's testimony was detailed and consistent. By March 24, Charles Sennett had also been arrested and charged with capital murder. The pastor who had called 911 claiming to have discovered his wife's body was now the prime suspect in orchestrating her death. On March 25, 1989, exactly 1 week after Elizabeth Sennett's murder, Charles Sennett took his own life. He died by gunshot in a hotel room, leaving behind a note but no full confession. His death removed one defendant from the case, but it also removed any hope of a full accounting of his role in the conspiracy. The case against Kenneth Smith and Billy Gray Williams was built on multiple layers of evidence. First, there were the confessions. Williams had given a full account of the crime, implicating both himself and Smith. While Smith continued to deny involvement, his story had inconsistencies that investigators easily dismantled. Second, forensic evidence tied both men to the scene. Fingerprints, fibers, and other trace evidence placed them inside the Sennett home on the night of the murder. Third, there was the money. After Charles Sennett's death, investigators traced financial transactions showing that he had withdrawn $1,000 in cash shortly before the murder, matching the amount Williams said he and Smith had been paid. Fourth, there were witness statements. Multiple people testified that Williams and Smith had been seen together in the days before the murder, and that Williams had made vague references to a job he was planning. The evidence was overwhelming. Both men would face trial for capital murder. Billy Gray Williams was tried first in 1991. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Because Williams had cooperated with investigators and testified against both Smith and Charles Sennett before Sennett's suicide, prosecutors did not seek the death penalty for him. Kenneth Eugene Smith's trial began later that same year. The prosecution laid out a clear and damning case. Smith had been hired by Charles Sennett to kill Elizabeth Sennett. He had entered her home with Williams, participated in the attack, and accepted payment for the murder. Smith's defense argued that he had not been the primary attacker, that Williams had done the actual killing, and that Smith had been present but not actively involved. They portrayed Smith as a follower, someone manipulated by older, more experienced criminals. But the jury didn't buy it. On November 8, 1991, Kenneth Eugene Smith was convicted of capital murder. In Alabama, capital murder is defined as murder committed during the course of a robbery or murder for hire. Smith's crime qualified on both counts. The sentencing phase was brief. In Alabama at that time, the jury's sentencing recommendation was advisory. The judge had the final say. The jury voted 11-1 to recommend life in prison without parole. But the judge, citing the brutality of the crime and Smith's lack of remorse, overrode the jury's recommendation and sentenced Kenneth Smith to death. This practice, known as judicial override, was controversial even then. Alabama was one of only 3 states that allowed judges to override jury sentencing recommendations in capital cases. It would later be ruled unconstitutional by the Alabama Supreme Court in 2017, but by then, Kenneth Smith had already spent more than 2 decades on death row. Kenneth Smith's legal team immediately filed appeals, arguing that the judicial override was unconstitutional, that Smith had received ineffective assistance of counsel, and that the evidence didn't support a death sentence given that Williams, the confessed killer, had received life in prison. The appeals process dragged on for years. Smith's case went through the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, the Alabama Supreme Court, Federal District Court, and eventually the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Each time, His conviction and sentence were upheld. In 2017, the Alabama Supreme Court abolished judicial override in death penalty cases, but the ruling was not retroactive. Kenneth Smith's sentence stood. By 2022, Smith had been on death row for 31 years. He had exhausted nearly all of his appeals. And the state of Alabama set an execution date, November 17, 2022. November 17, 2022. William C. Holman Correctional Facility, Atmore, Alabama. Kenneth Eugene Smith, now 57 years old, was scheduled to die by lethal injection at 6 p.m. But from the beginning, things went wrong. The execution protocol required medical personnel to insert 2 intravenous lines into Smith's body, 1 primary line and 1 backup. These IVs would deliver a 3-drug cocktail designed to sedate, paralyze, and stop the heart. But Smith's veins were difficult to access. He was overweight. His veins were scarred from years of poor circulation and possibly past drug use. And as the medical team, whose identities are kept secret under Alabama law, attempted to insert the needles, they failed again and again. Smith would later describe the experience as torture. He said the medical personnel stuck him repeatedly in his arms, hands, and legs. He said they dug into his skin, searching for veins. He said he cried out in pain. He said he prayed. Witnesses in the viewing room watched in horror as the process dragged on. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. The curtains to the execution chamber were periodically closed as the medical team regrouped and tried again. By law, Alabama had a midnight deadline to complete the execution, tied to the expiration of the death warrant. As the clock ticked past 11 p.m., it became clear the execution could not be completed in time. At 11:21 p.m., Commissioner John Hamm of the Alabama Department of Corrections made the decision to call off the execution. Kenneth Smith was removed from the gurney and returned to his cell. He had survived. The failed execution of Kenneth Smith ignited a firestorm of controversy and debate. Human rights organizations, including the American Civil Liberties Union and Amnesty International, called the botched execution an act of torture. They pointed out that subjecting a person to hours of painful, failed attempts to establish for access violated the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Legal experts questioned how Alabama could attempt to execute Smith again without violating the constitutional protection against double jeopardy, being punished twice for the same crime. Smith's attorneys filed emergency motions arguing that subjecting him to a second execution attempt would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Medical professionals expressed alarm that the state had been unable to perform what should be a routine medical procedure, establishing for access. Some speculated that the secrecy surrounding the execution team's qualifications had contributed to the failure. Alabama law shields the identities of execution personnel, meaning the public has no way of knowing whether they are properly trained medical professionals or simply corrections officers with minimal training. But the state of Alabama was undeterred. Within weeks, officials announced they would seek a new execution date, and this time, they would use a different method. In January 2023, the Alabama Attorney General's office petitioned the Alabama Supreme Court to set a new execution date for Kenneth Smith, this time using nitrogen hypoxia, a method that had never been used to execute a human being in the United States. Nitrogen hypoxia involves placing a mask over the condemned person's face and replacing breathable air with pure nitrogen gas. The theory is that the person will lose consciousness within seconds due to lack of oxygen and die peacefully within minutes, unaware of what is happening. Proponents of the method argue it is more humane than lethal injection, which has been plagued by botched executions, drug shortages, and constitutional challenges. They point out that nitrogen makes up 78% of the air we breathe, and that death by nitrogen hypoxia should be painless, similar to the way pilots sometimes lose consciousness at high altitudes due to oxygen deprivation. But critics, including medical and scientific experts, raised serious concerns. They argued that there was no reliable data on how nitrogen hypoxia would work as a method of execution. Animal studies and industrial accidents involving nitrogen exposure suggested the process might not be as peaceful as proponents claimed. There were fears that Smith might experience air hunger, panic, or even convulsions before losing consciousness. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called the planned execution a form of human experimentation. The European Union urged Alabama to halt the execution. But Alabama officials pressed forward. On January 25, 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court set a new execution date for Kenneth Eugene Smith, January 25, 2024, exactly 1 year to the day after the court's ruling. On the evening of January 25, 2024, Kenneth Eugene Smith was once again brought to the execution chamber at Holman Correctional Facility. This time, there would be no IVs. Instead, Smith was strapped to a gurney and fitted with a full-face respirator mask connected to a canister of pure nitrogen gas. Witnesses were present. Smith was given an opportunity to make a final statement. According to witness accounts, Smith's final words were brief. He said, "Tonight, Alabama caused humanity to take a step backwards. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light." He then made a gesture described as a heart sign, with his hands toward his family members in the witness room. At approximately 7:53 p.m., the nitrogen gas began to flow. Within seconds, Smith began to convulse. His body shook violently against the restraints. Witnesses reported that the convulsions lasted for several minutes, far longer than the state had predicted. Some witnesses described the scene as disturbing and difficult to watch. Others said Smith appeared to be gasping for air, contradicting the state's claims that nitrogen hypoxia would be a peaceful death. After approximately 10 minutes, Smith's movement ceased. At 8:25 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Kenneth Eugene Smith became the first person in the United States to be executed using nitrogen hypoxia. The execution of Kenneth Smith using nitrogen hypoxia sparked immediate and intense debate. Supporters of the death penalty, including victims' rights advocates, argued that justice had finally been served for Elizabeth Sennett after 35 years. They pointed out that Smith had been convicted of a brutal murder for hire, and that his execution, while delayed and complicated, was the lawful consequence of his crime. But opponents of the death penalty, as well as medical and human rights experts, condemned the execution as a dangerous experiment. Dr. Joel Zivit, an anesthesiologist who has studied execution methods, called the use of nitrogen hypoxia unprecedented and reckless. He noted that the convulsions and prolonged movement suggested Smith had experienced significant distress before losing consciousness, contradicting the state's claims of a humane death. The European Union released a statement calling the execution a form of cruel and inhumane treatment. The United Nations reiterated its opposition to the death penalty and specifically criticized Alabama for using an untested method. Several other states, including Oklahoma and Mississippi, had previously authorized nitrogen hypoxia as an execution method but had never used it. Following Smith's execution, officials in those states indicated they might reconsider whether to move forward with the method. Elizabeth Sennett's family, who had waited more than 3 decades for Smith's execution, released a statement saying they were relieved that justice had finally been carried out. But they also expressed frustration that the process had taken so long and had been so fraught with complications. Billy Gray Williams, Kenneth Smith's co-defendant and the man who confessed to being the primary attacker in Elizabeth Sennett's murder, is still alive. He is serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole at Donaldson Correctional Facility in Bessemer, Alabama. As of 2024, he is 69 years old. Because Williams cooperated with investigators and testified against Smith and Charles Sennett, he was spared the death penalty. This disparity in sentencing, Williams receiving life in prison while Smith received death, was a central argument in Smith's appeals. Smith's attorneys argued that it was unjust for the confessed killer to receive a lesser sentence than the accomplice. But courts consistently ruled that Smith's lack of cooperation and remorse justified the harsher sentence. Charles Sennett, the man who orchestrated Elizabeth's murder, never faced trial. His suicide 1 week after his arrest meant he never had to answer for his crime in court. His death also meant that many questions about the conspiracy remained unanswered. How long had he been planning the murder? Were there other people involved? What would he have said in his own defense? Those questions will never be answered. In all the legal battles, media coverage, and debate surrounding Kenneth Smith's execution, It is easy to lose sight of the person this case was always about, Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett. Liz Sennett was 45 years old when she was murdered in her own home on March 18, 1989. She was a wife, a friend, a churchgoer, a woman who had trusted the wrong person. She was killed not by a stranger, not in a moment of passion, but in a cold, calculated act of betrayal orchestrated by the man she had married. She deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a person, someone who had hopes, dreams, and people who loved her. Her life mattered. Her death mattered. And no amount of legal wrangling or debate over execution methods can change the fact that a woman's life was taken and nothing can bring her back. Kenneth Smith's case forces us to confront difficult questions about justice, punishment, and the role of the state in taking human life. Is the death penalty justice, or is it vengeance? Should the manner of execution matter, or is the outcome, death, the only thing that counts? What do we owe to victims and their families? And what do we owe to the condemned, even those who have committed terrible crimes? Smith's case also raises questions about the competence and transparency of the execution process. How can a state fail so catastrophically to carry out an execution using a method it has used hundreds of times before? And is it ethical to experiment with new execution methods on human beings, especially when the evidence suggests those methods may cause significant suffering? These are not easy questions. Reasonable people can disagree about the answers. But what is clear is that the death penalty, as currently practiced in the United States, is deeply flawed. Botched executions, racial disparities in sentencing, wrongful convictions, and decades-long delays have eroded public confidence in the system. Kenneth Smith's execution, both the failed attempt and the successful one, will be studied, debated, and referenced for years to come. It is a case that reveals the best and worst of our justice system, the determination to hold people accountable for terrible crimes, and the messiness, cruelty, and uncertainty that often accompany that effort. On January 25, 2024, Kenneth Eugene Smith was executed by the state of Alabama using nitrogen hypoxia. He was 59 years old. He had spent 33 years on death row, more than half his life, for a murder committed when he was 24. His execution was historic, controversial, and deeply troubling. It marked the first use of nitrogen hypoxia as a method of execution in the United States. It came after a failed execution attempt that many described as torture. And it raised questions that will not be easily answered about how we as a society punish the worst crimes. But in the end, this case is not about Kenneth Smith. It is not about nitrogen gas or judicial overrides or legal precedents. It is about Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett, a woman who was killed by men she did not know, hired by a man she trusted, for the cruelest and most senseless of reasons. Her life was stolen from her on a quiet Saturday night in March 1989. And 35 years later, we are still grappling with the consequences of that loss. Justice, if it can be called that, has been served. But the scars, on a family, a community, and a nation, remain.